Good morning, class. It's me. This is our week on women as a minority group starting Tuesday, April 21st. And this is probably going to be a 2 video lecture, so bear with me. I want to try to summarize as much as possible in a short amount of time as possible, but some of the stuff in here is just like super, super important, and it's one of my favorite things to talk about in this class with regard to gender. When we talk about women as a minority group, when we talk about gender, we're talking about the gender binary. And we'll talk about this a little bit more next week when we talk about LGBTQ folk. But when we talk about the gender binary, we're talking about this idea that there's this dichotomy of gender between what is male on one side and what is female on the other side, this kind of rigid idea of what gender is, right? So when we talk about women as a minority group, it's important to understand that women are not less numbers. There's actually slightly more women in the world than there are men in most contexts, right? But it's important to understand, talking about women as a minority group, we talk about their status in society as subordinate to men, right? So we have to keep in mind the notions of power relations. Who has access to power in society? Who doesn't, right? A couple important terms I want to briefly define that are important to our understanding is sexism. Sexism is basically an ideology or a set of beliefs that men are superior to women. Misogyny is another important term, which means hatred or contempt for and or extreme dislike of women. That's not in the book, but that's an important term to talk about, right? It goes further than that. When we talk about patriarchy, we're talking about patriarchy as a social system in which men hold primary power and predominate in roles of political leadership, moral authority, social privileges, and control of property in women's bodies. And patriarchy, there's no magical Shangri-La anywhere in the world wherein we don't have some vestiges of patriarchy, right? There are some matriarchal and matrilocal societies in this world if we look at it from an anthropological basis. But by and large, it's about extent and degree to which patriarchy and these rigid social structures in which men are in power and women are subordinate exist in different degrees and different contexts, right? And different times, too. So it varies, right? And there's an important video I want you to watch. It's a short clip from Everyday Feminism. What is patriarchy and how does it hurt us all? And it's really important to understand it doesn't just hurt women, it also stifles men. So it's important to understand that, right? And it's important to understand also that when there are differences in the ways in which women may experience prejudice, oppression, discrimination, marginalization, and violence based on other markers of identity, not all women experience these things in the same ways or with the same severity. That's why it's important to take an intersectional approach when we're talking about women as a minority group or women who face discrimination, marginalization, violence, etc. With regard to that, there is a very important link because I don't think our book really talks about intersectionality enough. Right, there's a link that's entitled International Women's Development Agency. What does intersectional feminism actually mean? And intersectionality is a very important thing. It's kind of the idea that this term was coined by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, who analyzes one case in which there were several black women who sued for discrimination at a motor plant, and how the court ruled that they didn't really suffer discrimination because there were women in certain roles there, and there were black men in certain roles there. So it ruled that these women did not really experience marginalization, discrimination, etc. in their workplace because there were other women and black men who had advantages there, or had equal rights there, or had equal privileges there. It fails to take into account how one's identity as a black woman is compounded, and that makes the discrimination, marginalization, oppression doubled, right? So it's important to look at other markers of identity such as race, class, gender identity, national origin, religion, perhaps, things like that, other markers of identity that kind of compound the effect of discrimination, marginalization, and prejudice, right? And so it's like kind of like the idea a white upper class women will experience marginalization, if at all, much differently than a trans woman of color. Basically, if you can think about that, there's other things that kind of compound the marginalization of her. So that's important to understand. So definitely read that link because our book does not really go into that importantly, right? So in the United States, the book next talks about from a socio-historical perspective how women's roles have changed and their roles in society, how it originated from English times and then changed during the Industrial Revolution, where we see poor and immigrant women being recruited to work in factories and mills and things like that for wages that were even lower than the low wages that the men received. How higher class white women really didn't have to work. Middle class white women generally did not work. They were kind of placed on a pedestal sorts. Higher class white women, right? So they did have lack of rights, no right to suffrage, could not own property, could not testify in court, not permitted to enter into legal contracts, open bank accounts in their own names, things like that, sign a loan without a male cosigner. So there are all these things that led to early feminism in the United States, and particularly the suffragist movement, the movement for the right to vote, which was eventually codified into law through the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1919 by Congress. The states ratified it in 1920, the year later, which granted women the right to vote. Very important to understand that this did not help black women in the Jim Crow South who were prevented from voting because of Jim Crow laws, from poll taxes, violence, and other mechanisms that were used to prevent black people from voting, right? However, for white women, we see an increase in middle-class female participation in workforce outside the home after this time, particularly in World War II, where women were used to fill jobs that men vacated because of fighting in the war. However, after the war, these women were kind of fired and encouraged to return home and be the good housewives and mothers and everything to make room for the returning men, right? And then this led to the women's liberation movement in the late 1950s, early 1960s. One important book, and there's a clip here on our content folder from Encyclopedia Britannica. I use this just because it gives a decent summary of Betty Friedan and a book, The Feminine Mystique, which was a groundbreaking book that was published in 1963. And she was part of the second wave of feminism. The book starts with an introduction describing the problem that has no name. Right, the widespread unhappiness of women in the 1950s and early 1960s that were relegated to just being stay-at-home mothers, not being in the workforce. Some of them were college educated, and they were pushed into this kind of domestic servitude, if you will. Right. So Betty Friedan, this was a very important book. Betty Friedan became one of the founders of the National Organization for Women, and her activism and activism by others of the early second wave feminists such as Gloria Steinem and National Liberation for Women in the 1960s and the 1970s was really important. They fought male oppression and sexism, fought for reproductive rights, the pill, issues of sexualized violence, things like that, right? However, it's important to understand that this was disconcerting for other women. So if you had lower class women, working poor, women of color, particularly black women, and also Latinx women, you had a situation where these women were talking about, what the heck are you talking about? Like, we've been having to work for you people for our whole lives, because of our class, because of our race, right? So there were some problems with this movement that was considered basically a white feminist movement. And so then we get into later on with third wave feminism, the issues of intersectionality, etc., right? So the next section of the book talks about gender differences. Are there gender differences? Um, there are some biological differences that those who are assigned male at birth and those who are assigned female at birth may have, such as in terms of reproduction, organs, physical differences. To some extent, there's a brain function is different, right? However, it's important to understand, and we'll talk about this more next chapter, is that gender identity is an ascribed status. You're assigned this at birth. You're assigned male at birth or female at birth, and that society shapes this identity through socialization. So men and women are not born, but they are produced through learning traits and activities that are desired and normative for each gender. We internalize these proper norms of gender behavior, how we should act as men, how we should act as women, and this is, of course, dictated by culture, time, and place, and it varies, right, from context to context, from time to time, from place to place. So this is done through childhood socialization, right? How we produce men and how we produce women, right? So we are taught expectations about gender norms and proper behavior since childhood, and even in utero. Sometimes, like when we have gender reveal parties, is the new thing now, right? Um, there, I find that very problematic, right? But anyway, moving on, like as children, think about when we were children, we were encouraged to play in different ways with different kinds of toys. We were dressed differently, and sometimes we're disciplined and handled differently. And we model the behavior of other adults regarding proper gender behavior. So there are gender role expectations that influence us early in our lives. We learn to conform to them. This continues in school and will affect differences in behavior as boys and girls. Um, let's talk about gender policing, and this is done at an early age, starting at an early age, where we enforce normative gender ideals associated with the gender binary onto individuals, like what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, and then think about some of the ways in which we police proper gender behavior, like what is proper gender behavior for girls, what is proper gender behavior for boys, right? We have these influences also in advertising. And also representations in music. If you think about some music videos, right, some of the gendered images that we see of men and women, right? But with advertising, this is really interesting because this can also reinforce traditional gender roles and stereotypes. And also, we see the sexualization of women to sell products, right? There's a great quote from Gene Kilborn, who wrote Killing Me Softly. On page 396 and 97 in my version of the book, there's a great quote I would like you to read and concentrate on. So think about some of the effects of highly gendered images of women in media, advertising, film, etc., on women as well as men's perceptions of themselves and each other. And this was going to be the project I wanted you to we were going to do, but we're not going to do now because of coronavirus. But think about some of the effects of this. And there's one link I wanted to show you in particular in our content folder called MPR Girls and Boys Life Magazine Covers Uproar. So look at those magazine covers and look at the ways in which what is expected behavior for men or boys and what is expected for girls, right? And these two magazine covers really shows this kind of the ways in which we try to mold proper male behavior, proper female behavior for girls and boys, and then they fixed it later in the article. If you scroll down, they fixed it later. But like, it's important to really look at that, right, and to understand that. So I'm going to stop this video now. We'll move on to video 2. So thank you for your patience, and on to video 2.